All right, so we're trying out a little something new uh, recently. So I've been putting a lot of time into developing and curating and playtesting, etc., of a Pioneer Cube, which uses the current Pioneer legality. It's kind of curated for more of a modern drafting experience than you would typically experience in normal cubes, but hopefully without the only going mid-range problem that something like Modern Cube would have. Now, we run into philosophical issues that there's not really great combo potential in stuff like Modern or Pioneer Cube because a lot of the combo decks in these formats are built off of like non-traditional stuff, like not Splinter Twin level combo where you get your two cards and you just win the game. It relies more on like engine pieces and snowballing ahead, or in the case of things like Dredge, you need 4 copies of, say, Prized Amalgam and Creeping Chill and stuff like that, which for obvious reasons isn't feasible in a typical cube. So the idea is to use like certain like synergy based archetypes as kind of like your replacement combos. So for example, in Pioneer that would be maybe in Soul Artifact or like Crackling Drake stuff. So there's kind of some wonky stuff that you can do in the cube, but in general it should reflect more of an interactive based limited format than we're typically used to. So I went ahead and did a draft with CJ, who many of you may know if you're local to the Kingslayer area, but if you haven't actually met him, well, now's your chance to be introduced to not necessarily the greatest aspect of Magic for him, but one that he would like to work on a little bit. So anyway, we've been talking about Cube off and on, and we decided to do a little bit of a draft. So he ended up as you can see on screen, the Boros archetype, which is a little bit looser of an archetype. It's kind of just like red-white aggro. There's not a ton of typically what we see in a lot of cubes is there's not a ton of varied game plan potential among the red-white decks in general. They're trying to just kill the opponent. Sometimes you go wide, sometimes you go big if you're playing like in a cube where there's stuff like Feather and like Heroic and stuff like that, where you can take that route. But in general, you just want to prioritize good efficient creatures, some evasion, a little bit of removal, and you generally want to look at things that put a bunch of bodies on the board. So because ultimately you are attacking. So we say it a little bit here. Now he did end up doing a lot of things right. I think, like, Wingmate Rock, absolutely incredible card, particularly in this cube. Lyra's like pretty decent if people are trying to attack, so it's kind of just like a solid 5-drop. Siege Gang is also like pretty reasonable, and depending on how many goblins you have, it gets like significantly better. But not necessarily one that I would be super happy with. I'd prefer like a Glorybringer or a Stormbreath Dragon, or maybe even like some splashable 5-drop. Because you can draft like 2 dual lands and then splash a card. So, but overall, like, decent top end, and again, and he's got like some really good 4-drops, and one of the highlighting aspects of this cube in particular is that the red-white color combinations have just pushed non-synergy cards like Tectonic Giant or Rekindling Phoenix. These are just fantastic cards on their own. And that's kind of the hallmark of this strategy is you don't go super deep on any particular synergy, but you try to just pick up really, really good rate creatures. So on that note, he's got a little bit of a party sub-theme going on, which you actually will see multiple decks in this cube draft go, because basically all the party payoffs are in this cube. And Squad Commander is probably like the best one. So even getting a couple of creatures off of it is fantastic, and if you ever trigger party, you're just likely going to win the game. So it's an actual 4-drop that ends the game. That's good to take like some subpar creatures to maybe like make it work a little bit. So overall, like, this deck's got like a decent curve. As you can see, like, it's got like a bunch of 1s and 2s. Now generally I like to compare 1-drops and 2-drops because you're not always able to rely on playing him on turn 1. So he's got like decent stuff to do early, and then he's got like 3s, 4s, and 5s that he can do, and it's basically like the deck. So the curve isn't terrible, but I think there's some potentially questionable card choices. There's definitely some upgrades that can be done when we dig into the sideboard, but I'll also talk a little bit at the end about things he potentially could have drafted over these, or maybe what you want to be on the lookout for if you're looking to be a non-synergy deck in these types of cubes. So first I'm going to break into the 1-drops. So they're kind of just generic ones. We've got Grim Initiate, Legion's Landing, Monastery Sphere. So one of the things to notice about cube drafts in general is when you're navigating an early draft, like pack 1, say, oftentimes you want to pick like a big bomb early, or take some mana fixing, or like a splashable like multicolor card that's like pretty good. Typically you don't end up taking too many things that like force you into particular archetypes. You want to prioritize things that keep you open. So you'll see like taking a lot of the Zendikar Moto double-faced cards, or maybe you take like a splashable party threat, or like Aluris, because he's just like incredibly good. So there's a lot of potential, like first picks here could have taken like Stonecoil or Hangerback Walker, but so like overall you want to be looking at things that allow you to kind of pivot between archetypes. And in that sense, when you start narrowing down towards a particular color or color combination, you want to start looking at picks that aren't necessarily synergy picks, but that can bridge multiple archetypes. So, Swiss Sphere is good in red aggressive decks, it's good in 2-color aggressive decks, but you could also potentially play it in like a blue-red spells deck or something if you get like that and Soulscar Mage, and you get a little, and like Heartfile Immolator, and now you can play like a non-conventional blue-red deck if like blue looks super open. So one of the drawbacks of playing Boros in this particular cube, though, is you have a lot of double white or double red cards that make it a little bit more difficult to pivot. So I think there's a lot of pressure on decks like this to actually take some of the party creatures, because they're some of the best ways to pivot archetypes. And they reward you if you end up snagging a late squad commander, which it kind of looks like he did based on the fact that he doesn't actually have very many party creatures. There's actually quite a bit in red-white. It's the archetype that has the most different creatures with the party creature types. And red in particular has every creature type except for Cleric in this cube. It even has a couple of rogues that are actually pretty decent in the aggressive decks on their own. So one thing that I would also like to point out about this deck is that it's mostly focused on like curving 2, 3, 4, which I think is generally a good spot to be for cubes like this, where they're just a little bit slower, or the 1-drops aren't quite as good. As you can see, like Grim Initiate is like a pretty weak card. I don't really want to be playing this card on turn 2 or 3. I really only want it on turn 1. And like I can largely say the same for Legion's Landing, but at least there's scalability with landing. If you have like a good curve, you can go Legion's Landing, 2-drop on turn 3. You can flip it if you have like a haste creature or whatever. So it's like pretty good, but generally you want to be looking at 1-drops that can scale up a little bit, which would be your Legion's Landings, your Monastery Spears, and cards like Grim Initiate are generally going to be filler, and you're going to be able to get them later. But a lot of their value comes with the synergy picks. So Grim Initiate, for example, is one of those bridge cards that we looked at, where you can play it in the aggressive decks if you want. You could play it in say, like, Red-Black Sax. So, like, maybe, say you ended up, like, having these as like your first few picks. Okay, well, like you could be an aggressive deck, you could be like some sort of weird mid-range deck, but there's also a chance that you end up in Red-Black Sack. So taking a card like Grim Initiate allows you to not only fulfill some more party requirements, but it also allows you to stay a little bit more open if say you get like a Mayhem Devil, or like a Priest of Forgotten Gods, and you can start pivoting towards that Red-Black Sacrifice archetype. So just one of those things to look at is it's a very unassuming 1-drop, and you don't really ever want to pick it highly, but sometimes it's kind of free to pick because it keeps you open, and that's really something that's highly valuable in the first pack, because you're trying to navigate and get the best possible set of cards that you can before narrowing it down to a particular archetype. Especially in a cube like this, where almost every card in the cube is playable in color combinations, so I don't really feel embarrassed to put any of them in my deck because there's a purpose for all of them. We're not just relying on the raw power of the cards or the synergies that they have. There's very few cards that are only good with one or two other cards in the cube. So, as long as you have a reason for picking a card, then it's usually pretty solid. So that's also why like the Moto double face cards are pretty good, because yeah, they don't help you splash, and oftentimes you can't really splash them. Like Hagra Mauling is like very difficult to splash. But if there's like a good chance you're in those colors, well, it's kind of just like a free card to include in your deck, because you're totally fine just like taking mana fixing anyway. So like taking like a Sheffet Dunes, which is effectively McKindy Stampede, is like pretty reasonable. So I like to try and be on the lookout for a lot of those types of effects. So this deck has a lot going in that regard, and it kind of looks like he couldn't quite get together a lot of the party creatures, which is potentially a misassessment in drafting. So as I had mentioned before, you kind of want to stay open a little bit, and you get a little bit rewarded for that in red-white, since most of the early game creatures have one of the party types. So it is one of the macro archetypes for red-white, and you get a lot of incidental value from it, just because there's a lot of good aggressive creatures. So like something like Seeker of the Way is one of those bridge cards where you can play it. You could like splash it in a blue-red deck that's like spells heavy. You can play it in a removal heavy black deck. But it's also a warrior, which does help with a little bit of the party creature types. Or something like Pious Evangel isn't typically a card that we're used to seeing, but it is in this cube because it does have a party creature type. So, and it also lets you like potentially turn into a red-black sacrifice, but maybe you can end up like playing just red-white sacrifice and having this as kind of like a Cartel Aristocrat effect. So there ends up actually being a lot that you can do when drafting this particular archetype. Other cards that I think you need to be on the lookout for in cubes like this would be stuff like Hidden Dragon Slayer, which is a removal spell, but it's also a party creature type. And generally speaking, if you have synergies that are possible within color combinations, taking creatures that are a little bit slower but like give you that synergy while also replacing quote unquote one of your removal spells is pretty appealing. So because it can be very difficult if you're actually somewhat drafting for synergy, or if there's an incentive to take particular cards because of their synergistic effects, to also fit in enough removal spells. So I think it's really important when drafting this cube that you understand that you actually have more than 18 lands in most of your decks, and you have more than like 24 spell slots in a lot of your decks because of the modal double face cards. So you're going to get a lot of decision points where you're looking to play more cards than you're normally used to when drafting. So sometimes you have to prioritize just playing more creatures or playing cards that are a little bit slower because other people are slowing their decks down. So that's why I tend to value cards like Hidden Dragon Slayer quite highly in a cube like this, where a lot of the aggressive power from these creatures comes from not really their raw stats. So an example of another card that I would value pretty highly in basically any aggressive strategy would be something like Seasoned Hellblade or Luminarch Aspirant, where there's a very narrow set of cards that actually interacts with them profitably, and they can get out of hand pretty quickly. So there actually is a ton of aggressive options in red-white, and it's pretty difficult to not get a little bit more of a mix of creature types, particularly when you start looking at the morph cards. Like Jeering Instigator and Hidden Dragon Slayer, I think are two of the ones that I value probably like the most of like all the utility creatures possible. Just because like red rogues are really, really hard to come by, and Jeering Instigator is one of them, and the other one is Robber of the Rich, and they both have like a late game use. So like not having to play an active treason effect in your deck because now you have Jeering Instigator means that you can take that extra slot and maybe you can go up a land, or maybe you can play an extra creature on top of that and make sure you're hitting your party counts. And even if you're not actually drafting for party, by picking a card like that, it means that your aggro deck doesn't really run out of steam as much, so you can afford to maybe like play an extra 5-drop or something like that. So I think it's really important when you're drafting aggressive decks in Cube to actually not just stat check everything. You can't just take your Savannah Lions. You can't just take your like Grizzly Bear pluses. Like it's not just about combat stats. And I think it's a little bit of where this draft may have gone wrong. We see that a little bit with taking like Stone Cold Serpent and Anafenza and Knight of the White Orchid, is they all pass like the Grizzly Bear test. Where they're all like pretty reasonable 2-drops. But the utility is a little bit lacking in a deck like this. There's not a ton that you can do with Knight other than the fact that it's a 2/2 for a striker, right? It doesn't actually contribute to turning on your squad commander or, enabling like better attacks with the rest of your board. So it also doesn't have any real form of evasion. And that's kind of the resounding theme with his particular draft deck is a lot of the creatures just kind of look stat checked. One of the other things to keep in mind when drafting these types of decks is, and this is what he did totally correct, is prioritizing cards like Lurrus and Militia Bugler. So typically white and red as an archetype in most cubes struggles with a lot of card advantage. You can run them out of resources by just killing their creatures that matter, or because they don't have access to the raw draw power and selection power that the other 3 colors have access to. So it's really nice when you can get like reasonable creatures like Militia Bugler that helps you dig for like maybe you grab a Siege Gang commander, like best case scenario, but even under normal circumstances, just like grabbing Grim Initiate is fine because it lets you like put more bodies onto the board. And Lurrus does a similar thing, but instead of digging through your deck for that, it lets you replay your 1 and 2 drops, which is another way to make like otherwise mediocre 1-drops like Grim Initiate a bit better. So I do like that aspect of this deck. Now, what I would have liked to have seen is a little bit more attention to that as an option, like because there's a lot of creatures here that are just like okay to grab and not particularly great, but cards like Militia Bugler, they don't really go well with stat check creatures, because if I'm grabbing a Knight of the White Orchid and I'm playing this on turn 4, it's pretty weak. 2/2 on turn 4 is not really where I want to be, but if this had some sort of utility in the late game, like, say, a Selfless Spirit or a Remorseful Cleric, then, like, maybe it actually lets me edge out a little bit. Or, say, it's a Subira, right? And I grab that, and then I use that, and I can set up, like, a big turn past a bunch of blockers. So, I think it's really important when you're drafting red-white as an archetype in this cube to actually pay attention to a lot of the utility creatures, because that's kind of what makes these aggro decks work. That's kind of what they're built around, is you've got a lot of party creatures that you could potentially draft, and you've got a lot of utility creatures you could potentially draft, and there's not actually a ton of stat checking that's beneficial, because there's not very many pump spells, and there's not a ton of unconditional removal. A lot of it's toughness-based, so I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of that. Alternatively, I do think splashing the Malakir Blood Priest was fantastic. This card's absolutely incredible. You can grab it off Bugler, you can recast it with Lurrus. It's a party payoff that's actually really good in aggressive decks because it gives you some reach. You can do like some weird things where you like reanimate it, or you blink it with like a Charming Prince, stuff like that. So there's actually a lot of different tools in this color combination that help you abuse it. So, and it's one of those things where it kind of highlights why picking up creatures with the party creature types is kind of a way to stay open, because you don't feel bad splashing 1 or 2 off-color party creatures if you have like reasonable party payoffs, which he ended up getting into reasonable party payoffs later, and being able to make the decision to pivot more into that, I think is a beneficial thing. As you can see, if I've taken Anafenza and Militia Bugler, my ability to pivot is not great, because I can't really splash the Anafenza, so if I want to play this card, I'm effectively locking myself into white. And it just doesn't have a ton of utility, it's kind of just another stat checking one. But Militia Bugler can like keep you open because you can splash this card into some decks, and just a lot of creatures that work well with it. So the other thing that this deck is lacking is removal. So it does have a Deck and Stone and a Soul Seer, but neither one of these is particularly efficient or great removal. Um, Deck and Stone is card disadvantage, and it's kind of slow. Soul Seer can hit like a little bit of bigger things, but it's also like a little bit overcosted for that type of effect. Something like Mizium Mortars, or really even like 2 mana 3 damage, or cards like Fiery Impulse, which he had in his sideboard, I think would have been a little bit better. And then you can board into like more unconditional slow removal spells if you need them. So, particularly in a deck that wants to be tapping out on turn 4 and turn 5 for a bigger threat, oftentimes more efficient removal is better. So, I think that's a really important aspect of the red-white decks in general, is you don't have great catch-up mechanisms because you don't play particularly well with the numerous board wipes that are available to the archetype. So you want to value the removal spell efficiency in the early game, because your 4 and your 5 drops are just so good at winning the game on their own. They're evasive, there's a lot of flying, a lot of them put like multiple bodies onto the board, so they're good against removal spells. So oftentimes what you're trying to do is you're trying to ensure that tempo's in your favor when you're drafting this archetype. So try and pay attention to more efficient removal spells when you have good 4s and 5 drops in general, because you're more like, you can always, like, maybe you take a turn off and you play a tap land, well, and then I have 5 mana and I can play a 4-drop and a 1 mana removal spell, but there's no way I'm ever playing a 4-drop and a 3 mana removal spell. So, because a lot of times if you ever have to Soul Seer a 2-drop, you kind of understand why most of the time you'd rather have a cheaper removal spell. It's just a little bit more likely that you're spending removal spells, particularly in aggro decks and cube, on their early creatures, because you want to get that chip damage in before they can actually trade with their blockers. So that's one of the things to keep in mind, particularly when you have cards like McKindy Stampede, where you would much rather not trade away those early creatures. You want the extra bodies around, and there are also like more things to potentially sack with like Kazul's Fury, and I think one of the most important things with drafting particularly the wide aggressive decks in this cube is oftentimes it is correct to not attack, because your opponent could make a trade for one of your party creatures, and the party payoffs are really, really important at getting a lot of velocity into later turns. So, it's one of those interesting situations where preserving your board state is generally more important than anything else. So the cheap removal spells that let you play a threat and kill their guy, or just kill their early blocker, tend to be the best way to leverage your 2s and your 3 drops in this cube. So, for the aggressive decks, at least. So the other thing too is like History of Analia is a card that, with removal of knights as an archetype, it got significantly worse as like a dominant payoff threat, but it is still just an incredible card on its own. It's multiple bodies onto the board. Vigilance is actually like pretty good in a lot of these decks, because creatures are kind of designed to trade with each other a lot in this cube. It's kind of a way to like balance out on the party mechanic and make some more interesting decisions. So being able to have like Vigilance is pretty nice. Yeah, and like sometimes you randomly get stuff like Knight of the White Orchid where it gets buffed up by history. So there's definitely like some cross synergy there, which is maybe a reason to just keep the Knight of the White Orchid. That, and it could be mana fixing if you go like Plains, and then you play Knight and you grab like Sacred Foundry, for example. But you can value Knight of the White Orchid a little bit more highly when you have Plains Shocklands and you're trying to like splash a card. So if he had a Godless Shrine, I would never cut Knight of the White Orchid, because you can like take a turn off, particularly when you have these lands, the Muddle double-faced ones, where you can take a turn off to like play an extra spell, and then on the next turn use Knight to mana fix for your black to play like a Malakir Blood Priest. So that's one of the things with Knight that I think is interesting in this cube. But in this particular deck, it just being a 2/2 first striker isn't particularly great. I think I would value something like Fearless Fledgling quite a bit more. Things that get a lot better in this cube relative to a lot of others because of the Muddle double-faced cards is anything with landfall, or anything that checks the amount of lands that you have. So Dragon Master Outcast, Fearless Fledgling, Tireless Tracker, which is already a fantastic cube card anyway. So anything with landfall, because initially he was playing 4 plains, 4 swamps, and 4 mountains, which put him at 19 lands for an aggro deck. And the reason you can do that is because of all the modal double faced cards. So, and that's a pretty average amount of lands, I would say, in this cube, because these cards, you kind of just take them a lot of times because they, ordinarily I would never like draft this card in cube. I wouldn't draft this card for 4 mana. I wouldn't draft it for 3 mana in most decks. But if it can also be a land sometimes, then I maybe take effects that I wouldn't ordinarily have access to in your average cube deck, and I get to play them in these decks now. So you get more spells and more lands. So cards like Fearless Sledging or Dragon Master Outcast, I would prioritize a little bit higher, and I would prioritize them more based on how many of these types of lands you have. Then, and by that token, the more of these lands that you have, and the more that you're actually relying on them to be lands, do keep in mind that it does slow your curve down a little bit. So, that's why cheap removal spells are better than cheap threats for a lot of these decks, even the aggressive decks, because oftentimes you can't play your 2-drop on turn 2 because you're playing a tap land on turn 2, or you can't play your 1-drop on turn 1. So oftentimes you're going to have to pick whether or not you want to play your 1, 2, 3, or 4-drop on curve. And with that, it's nice to have cheaper removal spells where you can justify taking a turn off because you've traded with their board. Especially, 1-for-1ing your opponent with removal spells is a lot more appealing in a deck that has effectively 5 more spells than it ordinarily would have. So these cards also allow you to make trades more profitably than you ordinarily would. So I think we can kind of value party creatures a little bit more. We can prioritize cheap removal. These are 2 important facets in particular for drafting this cube, and in this particular draft that I think that I think maybe could have fixed some of the issues with it. Not that it's a bad draft deck, but it's not a particularly great one. I think there's some critical issues with it. One of the other things I would like to mention is it's very hard to splash double pips, double colors. Like, Hogger Mauling is a little bit different because if you're splashing, say, a Malakir Blood Priest on its own, you maybe want 3 black sources, 4 if you need to cast it earlier in the game, in which case it's pretty free to include Hogger Mauling as your 3rd black source, because if you ever, it's incredibly small that you would ever end up casting it as a removal spell, but it gives you the option if you've already had access to both of your swamps, and then your third black source is effectively a removal spell. Note that's a bit different than something like Gonti, which is terrible if you don't have 2 black sources. You can't even play it as a land to be able to cast your single black pips. So I probably wouldn't splash Gonti in a deck like this without having access to, say, 6 black sources, which you would need dual lands in order to fulfill. But Hogger Mauling, I think, is totally fine. And you can play like 2 other swamps and be able to facilitate pretty consistent casting of Malakir Blood Priest. And with something like Lurrus, the swamps aren't even terrible either. And that's one of the things we see about this cube is, like, there's some hybrid creatures, and the artifact creatures are pretty decent. So, like, you can still cast these off of a swamp as easily as you can off of a plains. So it does feel pretty good even in the aggressive decks to be able to splash a card, particularly a pretty good party payoff. Now in this deck, it's not a great party payoff, because the only 2 creature types he has are Warrior and Cleric, so it's only ever going to drain for 2. But that's still, like, pretty reasonable for a 2-drop, and you've got, like, the Lurrus interaction, so I think it's generally worth it. But I would not splash the Gonti, and I think it's going to come up in more games than not, where you draw Gonti, you just can't cast it, You also don't have a way to discard it, so it kind of just rots in your hand, and you're not going to get much value from it. Um, so things I think that you could have done a little bit differently in deck construction is maybe evaluate some of these cards a little bit differently. PNLR is just a fantastic card. It's two bodies for one, which kind of makes it stat checking a 3-mana 3/3, which is reasonable anyway. But it's got evasion. You can like make a big turn where you just pump up one of your artifact creatures a bunch, maybe say a Stonecoil Serpent. But it also gives you a way to trigger your own Hanger Backwalkers, which I really like in the aggressive decks. So I would value PNLR incredibly highly. I would absolutely play this card in the main deck. You can also grab it off Militia Bugler, which is super sick. Outpost Siege is one of those cards that's also that, in addition to just being a standalone good card, it also kind of gives you reach and allows you to bridge into kind of that aristocrat style gameplay where you can just set it on dragons, and now sacking a goblin to a sieging commander can pick off like two things, or you can PNLR, sack Hangerback Walker, like make a bunch of Thopters, hit them for one, start sacking the Thopters, draining them again. So it gives you more reach in addition to a form of card advantage that these decks are noticeably lacking. And that can be a way to make up for a lack of good removal spells as well, is to just play these cards that require specific answers from your opponents. On that note, he does have one efficient removal spell, Fiery Impulse, which, while it's very rarely going to deal 3 damage in this deck, I think I would still play it. It does come up where you can go like Spear on 1, Fiery Impulse their guy, attack them for 2, play one of your tap lands, and then set up for turn 3. And because it's a 1-mana removal spell, being able to play like 2 spells in one turn, or just be able to play one of these tap lands for free, quote unquote, without taking a big tempo hit, I think is one of the ways that you can make this type of mana base work in an aggressive deck. So Fiery Impulse is one of those cards that I think you absolutely need to look at playing in this deck. Sabir is a card that I still have yet to ever cast, but I think if there's a deck that's good for it, I think this is one of those decks. It doesn't have a ton of ways to pump up its creatures. You do want to churn through your deck a little bit, and even just making, like Knight of the White Orchid unblockable over and over again is pretty good. But you can also do some cool tricks where you have a Goblin Rabblemaster and a Sabira, and you activate this on main phase, or in response to the attack trigger, to make your Rabblemaster unblockable, and then it gets the big boost from all of the goblins. So Sabira only checks on resolution, so you can do like some cool things with that. So I would definitely look at trying to fit Sabira in as well. I think the card is pretty good, and I think it's actually it doesn't have relevant party creature types. So a lot of your so a lot of your other party decks aren't really looking at picking up Sabira, because the 3-drop slot is kind of where you get the rest of your creature types. There's like, black has, wizards, it's got warriors, it's got all kinds of stuff at the 3-drop slot, and so does red. So, and the 3-drops in general in this cube tend to be pretty good. So you need to have a reason to play a card like Sabira over a lot of the other like slam dunk ones. Like obviously you're going to play Rabblemaster if you can. So, but if there is a deck that this is good, and I think it's probably this one. So, and you can use it in kind of the way that you would use Bomat Courier, where you can just convert like dead cards in your hand and onboard presence into real card advantage to maybe just find enough ways to close out those final points. And I think that's particularly important in a deck like this that has access to Kazul's Fury and Malakir Bloodpriest plus Luris, to where you actually have like pretty good closing power. So the last one that was of note in the sideboard is Basri's Solidarity, which is pretty easy to overlook. There's this deck in particular doesn't have any +1/+1 counter payoffs, and it's kind of one of those cards where you wouldn't play this effect if you didn't have a lot of creatures in your deck. If you just had if you go like 1-drop, 2-drop removal spell, 3-drop creature, maybe Basri's Solidarity isn't too good, because just putting 1 +1/+1 counter or 2 +1/+1 counters among creatures, you can do better than that with other spells. But I think in this kind of deck, it's really important because you don't have much efficient removal, so you can mitigate that somewhat by having big, giant board swings. And Basri's Solidarity also is deceptively powerful in this type of cube because it rewards you for preserving your board presence with all your party creatures. That's one of the play patterns we see with the white decks in this cube, is they only try to make attacks that are free attacks with them. And then you set up a big board, you milk your party payoffs, or you start grinding out with Militia Bugler plus like Charming Prince, or some other engine piece, until eventually you either stick a 5-drop or you land cards like McKinley's Stampede or Basri's Solidarity, where you've played it a little bit slower, and now you get a big giant turn where you could maybe go turn 5 Goblin Rebel Master or like whatever, and like a 2-mana removal spell, clear the way. Now they have to take a turn off to kill your Rebel Master, which means they likely haven't developed more on their board, and then you can like Basri's Solidarity plus like Outpost Siege or whatever. Like there's a lot of cool different things that you can do with this card, while also having like small amounts of +1/+1 counter synergy. So maybe you look at taking something like Absent Falconer if you have this card, because then you can just set up like a combo kill of sorts, where you just hit turn 5 and now all of your creatures have flying for the rest of the game. So I would actually value this card pretty highly, and generally these types of normalized aggro decks, they want the actual stat payoffs. So because it kind of doubles or like increases the efficiency of your creatures by anywhere from 50% to 100%. So if I have 4 creatures and my opponent has 2 blockers and I play Basri's Solidarity, suddenly that takes a turn or two off of the clock. So this card is really powerful. In addition to just giving you more free attacks, there's a lot of creatures in this cube that are like 2/3s and 1/3s and stuff like that, to where having a 3/2 is actually pretty good. So this does mean that you need to make some cuts, and I would probably look at cutting the Soulseer initially. And for this particular deck, I'm not sure exactly whether I would want to be 18 or 19 land, but I think there's an argument for not playing Hagra Mauling and just relying on Malakir Blood Priest being like a late game card. There's also a world in which you just don't play it at all. But for sure you're going to play these. You may not play these, but I think Anafenza is a little bit better than Knight of the White Orchid here. Anafenza works. It's a little bit awkward with Sabira, because your creatures get a little bit bigger, but it's just like pretty good with like Luris and like random nonsense that I think I would be incentivized to play it. Now, it not triggering on tokens is actually pretty relevant though. But I think I would cut the Deccan Stone is tough to cut because it is a semi-efficient one, though admittedly it's not great. But this would currently put you at 18 lands, which I think is a little bit more ideal than having to play like a little bit of the slower game. Like, I don't think I would really want to cut any of these. Maybe you cut CGN Commander, but I think it's too important, particularly when you have like stuff like Goblin Rebel Master, Outpost Siege, and Basri's Solidarities. You actually have like good payoffs for all these tokens that you're making. So I think the only other cut that you could really look at is something like Anafenza, or maybe you cut like the Grim Initiate, even though it's a warrior, because your one big party payoff is already a warrior. So this doesn't really matter in terms of party payoffs, once you've cut the Malakir Blood Priest. So you also could just splash the Malakir Blood Priest anyway, and like replace the Anafenza with it, and like have like it's not super likely that you have it as a 2-drop, but it gives you the option. So it's kind of puts you at like, because see, Basri's Solidarity doesn't count, but like I would count Fiery Impulse as kind of like a 2-drop. Plus you have Skyclave Cleric, which you're kind of treating as a 2-drop anyway. This card's almost never a land in this type of deck, because like having a Cleric is really important for the party payoff. So if you end up running with something like this, then that puts you at 17 normal lands, which I think is pretty healthy for this type of deck. And if you cut the Grim Initiates, then you can run up to 18 lands, because then you can run 2 swamps, and then you can just run a split of the mountains and plains, which I think is a little bit better. So obviously this changes a little bit if you actually end up being able to take to take cards like Hidden Dragon Slayer, or any of the rogues that you have access to in red, or a little bit more cheap removal. But overall, this deck is like pretty decent, and I think with a little bit of tuning, it would have been a little bit better. Not having to play Hogger and Gonti, I think, is a net positive for the deck, and I think there's an argument to not playing Malakir Blood Priest, though I think it is pretty nice to have access to, because you actually have a decent amount of reach. You've got a bunch of flyers, you've got Tectonic Giants. Sabira is actually a really powerful card in these aggressive decks if you're not like going for like heavy synergy, just because like being able to push through your small creatures that have been completely invalidated by like the 2/3s or the 1/4s or like even like big green creatures is super nice. So a lot of the decks in this format are going to try and play to the board, particularly with how much party there is, that oftentimes you're just going to be like in a situation where you just don't feel like it's profitable to offer the trade to your creatures, or maybe you just can't even attack because they get free blocks. That a Sabira just pushing through that damage, even without activating her to start like drawing extra cards, like just pushing through your small creatures, I think is really important. Especially, I mean, you also have Legion's Landing, so being able to guarantee that flips on a turn when you would basically have no business ever flipping it is pretty nice. Like, it's also pretty cool that of your 4 and your 5 drops, you never really need to make Rekindling Phoenix, Tech Giant, or Wingate Rock or Lyra unblockable, because they're very hard to block anyway. Siege Gang Commander, you can just make all of those unblockable. So like Sabira is kind of like a 3-drop that also scales in a similar way that PNLR would. History Benali is not a card like that, though, but it is just a couple of bodies that works really well with Basri's Solidarity, and it works pretty well with Sabira just in general, because you can just constantly push through these Vigilance attackers. So I do like a lot of what this deck is doing, and I think it does a lot right in terms of making red-white a viable archetype, because you've got a lot of stuff in this archetype that's intentionally designed to scale later. But I think there's a little bit of a misevaluation in the draft. It didn't look like picking up party creatures and staying open was particularly a concern. I think there was too much focus on just picking good, efficient creatures, which is definitely where you want to be, but you don't want to tunnel in too hard on that, and you want to be able to pivot if you find a big party payoff, because it looks like the squad commander was picked up maybe in pack 3, and it was too late to actually find really any party creatures at that point. So, and it looks pretty similar with the Malakir Blood Priest. So I would have liked to have seen a little bit more attention to being able to pivot. There are also like other cards that you can look that allow you to potentially go into other archetypes, as I said before, like Outpost Siege, Siege Gang Commander, Goblin Rabblemaster, all like pretty good in the red-black sacrifice deck. And you already have Lurrus as well, so like maybe, and like Hangerback Walkers, so like maybe there's an argument to be said for like taking a couple of black cards, because maybe you can pivot into that archetype, because even black-white sack is like pretty decent as well in a cube like this. So I think it was mostly just like valuing pivot creatures, I think was also really important. So yeah, like I think there's a lot that could have been improved on slightly, but I think overall, like, identifying the really powerful cards is where you want to be for Boros. But that wouldn't really be the case for something like, that wouldn't really be the case for a lot of the other color combinations, where they're more reliant on linchpin cards or particular synergies. But even something like red-green kind of plays in the same manner, where you can play like a late game ramp deck with it, but oftentimes you're just a pile of good creatures with removal. But even those decks want to value some of the splashable synergies, or they want to like start taking some of the utility party creatures as well. Particularly in limited, you can't just be stat checking everything. Utility is really, really powerful. So Alright. Yeah, so I don't think there's actually a ton that else that I really have to talk about with it. So I think that's probably going to do it, but I'm likely going to be drafting a bunch more, particularly with CJ, but with other people that are interested. It's content that I really really enjoy doing, and I can tend to ramble and run on a little bit with my draft analysis, but I draft cube all the time. I love it. It's probably my favorite format in Magic, and this is a cube that I built the cube, and I've put a lot of time into it because a lot of the decks and gameplay are kind of what I like the most in Magic. But I like to have a little bit of a challenge when it comes to both drafting and deck building, where I want basically every card I draft to be playable, and I need to kind of think about the game a little bit differently in order to come up with a deck that I think is more correct or a little bit better. And when almost all your cards are playable, it makes the deck building also a little bit more interesting because sideboard starts to matter a lot more. What are the circumstances where I would want Tithe Taker in, right? Like maybe, against decks that have a lot of removal spells. But oh yeah, and I guess that would be we totally forgot. Fearless Fledgling has to go in. That's like the one. Yeah, that was like the one creature I talked about like the whole time. Like, we're playing a ton of these spells that are lands. And it's also an evasive flyer. It gets counters and stuff. So, yeah, like Fearless Fledgling, 100% has to go in. But yeah, so like in what situations would I want to board into Tithe Taker or Knight of the White Orchid, right? That's an interesting question to think about. Whereas if these cards were just like obviously not good, if we were just stat checking everything, I would never really want Tithe Taker, and I would always want Knight of the White Orchid over it. So I really appreciate when a cube can challenge you in both the deck building phase and the drafting phase, because oftentimes we're used to being challenged in the gameplay and in the drafting phase, and the deck building for the most part kind of gets a little bit forgotten because you kind of build your deck as you're drafting. But my favorite cubes are ones where you're not really building your deck as you're drafting, you're building a set of different decks as you're drafting, and then by the end of the draft you kind of use the knowledge that you have of what other people could have drafted to try and like narrow down and customize what particular deck you're playing. So yeah, I mean that's kind of oh, looks like it didn't quite refresh it, but okay, yeah, it just looks like the display froze. So we'll yeah, there we go. So we'll reset that. I don't know at what point it froze, but there's definitely a point at which it did. So ultimately, this is kind of the final configuration I would settle on. I'm not exactly sure about all of the card choices. Like maybe you're supposed to play the Tithe Taker, and maybe you're supposed to play the Anafenza. Like there's arguments to playing both of these cards, and that's where I think a lot of personal preference can come into play. So but overall, I think the top end for the deck was great, and I think there were some good cards that were drafted, but there's clearly, as I've highlighted on the text a little bit here, there's clearly some ways that the deck can be improved. Party creatures and utility creatures are a good way to bridge and pivot. They also give you splash options, and cheap removal I think is really important as well. If I kill your early creature and I get to attack, it's kind of the same as if I threw a burn spell at your face. But you get rewarded if your opponent stumbles even more, because every turn that you preserve your creature and it gets a free attack, maybe it gets a free attack the next turn, and then so it allows your removal spells to go farther and farther as the game progresses. So and then yeah, like if you have a situation where you have 5 or 6 creatures in play because you've been like making profitable attacks, or you've been killing their early creatures while still being able to play your own threats, then like it makes cards like Basri's Solidarity, Outpost Siege, or McKindy Stampede way better than they ordinarily would be, because now you have a bunch of these ways to just end the game on the spot. So yeah, so I think there was definitely like some card evaluation issues. Like it seems pretty unlikely to me that you would not have been able to see cards that you could splash, that you would not have been able to see more different types of party creatures, because there's so many of these different types of cards out there, or even removal. It's pretty unlikely that you only saw these 3 removal spells. I think it's kind of an indicator that you didn't really take removal until you felt like you were forced to take removal or it was free to take removal. And I don't really think that that's like necessarily a good approach. One of the ways that you're supposed to approach cube drafting is sometimes your priorities change. You know, if you haven't been able to get like good efficient removal, you know, the first couple removal spells are far more important than like the seventh or eighth removal spell, and the same can be said for certain curve slots or certain types of creatures. So, you know, oftentimes it's about understanding what's important now in the draft and trying to like make that work. So, you know, I think there was definitely like, you know, some better drafting that could have been done as well, because you also run into the situation where a lot of these 3 drops are kind of replaceable. They do a lot of the same thing as other 3 drops. So did you necessarily need to take a History of Benalia, right? Like, maybe not. You know, maybe it was just a weak pack and you wanted to take a threat that was on color in pack 2, but maybe you picked it early in pack 1 and now you kind of tunneled into white when you maybe didn't need to. So it's just like a lot of those little things to think about, I think. But yeah, so let me know if you guys felt this was long. I feel like it was a little bit too long, or if it needs to be a little bit more structured, or what. But you know, this is kind of the stuff that I want to do. So just let me know.